Welcome back to Ask the Educator, a podcast for all professionals involved in medical device processing and sponsored by Healthmark Industries. The education team here at Healthmark has 280 years of combined experience in areas ranging from sterile processing, endoscopy, OR, biomed, to hospital and industry leadership. Our goal is to leverage our collective experience to answer one of your questions each episode, giving you the practical tips you need to succeed in the evolving world of device processing. My name is Kevin Anderson, clinical educator here at Healthmark, and I will be your host. Let's get started. All right, welcome everyone. Thanks for listening to Ask the Educator. I'm your host, Kevin Anderson, and for this episode, I have with me Seth Hendee. Seth is another educator here at Healthmark. And Seth, would you just share a little bit about yourself, introduce yourself to the listeners, and a little bit about your background?
Sure, Kevin. Thanks for having me. My background is SPD. I was actually started off as a technician 20 years ago at my local hospital up here in Burlington, Vermont. And the last 10 years or so, I really focused on education. And that's why something like competence really is near and dear to my heart, because it was a very large part of my responsibilities for that last period of time.
Yeah, so thank you, Seth, for joining me for this episode. As you mentioned or alluded to in your intro there, today we're going to be talking about competency training. I remember starting my career in the operating room, and we were set up with various preceptors, and they would show us all the various tasks and help us to learn about the different services in the operating room. And then again, I had to learn it for SPD. And it was much of the same. We were having a one-on-one preceptor every day that we came in. And we used to joke about it. It was sort of a see one, do one, teach one mentality. But really the reality was that you kind of did them in repetition, and you would take in some insights from your preceptor, and then you would do them until you were comfortable doing it on your own, and then they would sort of sign you off. But as things have been growing in complexity in our industry, and of course in the operating room as well, competency training has become so important. And it is something that even accreditation agencies are looking at. And so given the nature of our job, and I know that Seth, you had a lot of experience with competency training, what we want to know is how can our teams ensure that their competency training is in fact effective?
Absolutely. And that is something that you should be thinking about is, does what I have now in place work? Does it need to be updated? Because, that's just like everything else that we do. There are new methods and things like that. No matter how you do it, I really think it breaks down to two key components. The first being documentation and the documents that you use and you have to have. And the second being the time that you spend doing it.
So when you were documenting, did you make up your own documents, or did you borrow them from other organizations or from the IFUs, or how did you go about doing that?
Yes. Right. If somebody has something good, I think it's great to share. So I did actually have people say, well, do you have a base that I can start with? And so sharing is great. If there's a form out there that works for you, then I say take it and run with it. But that form, you have to remember, has to be specific to your facility. Because while there's recommendations and things like that, and there are a few laws that we have to follow, I might be able to do something slightly differently, or I might have to do something slightly differently because of my equipment, because of my facility, my that kind of stuff. So even a preset form should be a good base. And then you build your program on top of that, because they should reflect your own SOPs, standard operating procedure, practice document, work construction, right? They're again, different names for the same thing. So they should reflect that, and then they have to reflect the IFU. And so again, if we have shavers from two different companies, then we may have two different sets of steps for cleaning the shavers, and both of them are correct because we're both following the IFU. So you start with your documentation, and you need a couple. You need your practice document to be there. You need your instructions for use to be there. We've asked for them. We need them. And then you need a good form. So just like everybody else, just like having an IFU to clean an instrument, you think of your form that you use as the IFU for your competency. It's a form that an educator or a mentor or whoever does this competency follows every time. It tells me every box to check and every detail that I'm supposed to look for. And by doing that and by adding that consistency to the process, everyone's going to respect the process more, and it actually gives it a little more legitimacy. So if I'm having a bad day, I don't say, oh, I forgot to ask you about this piece because it was there in my documentation.
Yeah, well, as a nurse, Seth, I can definitely vouch for the importance of documentation and having sort of written instructions. For us, it's beat into us from the very get-go that if you didn't document it, you didn't do it. And it's that one last step that you have to do to finish your work, so to speak. So, and in the operating room, having that, we called it the WHO checklist or World Health Organization checklist. Before every single operating procedure, we had to go through a whole checklist of things to proceed with the surgery. And I can't tell you how important that was, because as much as you go through it and you feel like you have it committed to memory, we would still catch things during that procedure. And I think that that's something that our industry and SPD could definitely benefit from, those checklists and the forms and those standard operating procedures, and obviously the competencies along with it. So
absolutely.
In terms of a story, like what would that look like in your former role when you were actually performing these competency checkoffs with people?
Sure. I had a competency folder. There's and I will say about documents and documentation, if you have the chance to go digital with any of your documents, I suggest to do that. And there are simple ways that helps. For one, updating, right? When you can push it out digitally. Two, it helps for retrieval, right? So if I update an SOP and I can digitally push that update out, I don't have to change individual books throughout the department. And then when it's survey time and they say you've performed your competencies, you can pull these up, right? You just sit down and you're able to pull up your electronic records. So when I say documents and documentation, there's that piece, and then there's the retention part of it. And like I said, go digital if you can. So my competency folder was specific to every area and had to be updated often. We had 60 people in the department. And when I say updated, I meant, with the newest things for one, but also refill. Because I would show up and open this up. And if we were doing something in pack and prep, let's say, I had to have the document that I was going to use to actually check things off and make sure I was following along my same procedure each time. I had a copy of the practice. I like to think of myself as having a decent memory, but we know how this goes. And with technology keeps getting added, with procedures that keep getting added, to think that we can hold it all just in our head is kind of silly. And that's where I found actually some of the most slips occurring. Not that anyone was doing anything intentionally, not that someone was cutting a corner because they could or because they were trying to speed up, but simply because they forgot. I felt a bit like a cop, I suppose, with a radar gun, because I would step up. You knew that I was doing a competency because I had my pack and prep folder, and that had all of my work instructions and then a big stack of my check sheets so that I could check people off. And if you were doing something that required insulation testing, we had an SOP for checking instruments with insulation, and you got me standing there observing that competency. And I was reading our practice document, I had the check sheet, and I was watching you demonstrate that competency. I will say I never begrudged anyone who said, can I look at the policy? The biggest thing was I always made them look it up on the computer, because that's where it was. And that's where I wanted it referenced, right? That's always where the newest one was, not one that's printed and stuffed in a drawer somewhere. No, the newest one is on the computer. So I said, you may absolutely use the computerized procedure. It's why we put it there for you to reference, but you need to go to the computer to do it.
No, that's right. You outlined a great process for people that I think when it comes to competency training, we find that so many of our people are experienced. And so they just kind of get the quick check off like, oh, yeah, you've been doing this for years. Let's just sign the paper and be done with it. But I think it's very important that we're not just checking boxes and that we're actually checking on people to make sure, even the ones who've been there for 20 some years, that maybe they haven't developed some bad habits, or maybe somebody else told them something different that you weren't aware of and now they're doing things differently. So I think it's a great idea to have a procedure like that in place. Do you have like a story that really sort of outlines the challenges that you faced with competency checkoffs?
Absolutely. And this goes to my second point, which is time. It will take time to do this, and it may take time at an inconvenient time. So my story is going to the night shift, showing up at 2 and 3 in the morning to witness the night shift staff who were coverage for endoscope reprocessing. So if there was an emergent situation in the ED or something like that, and they pulled an endoscope, those could no longer sit until the next day when the endo department opened, right? That's a terrible old school thought that we know is not okay anymore. Well, our department was open 24 hours a day. We did clean other endoscopes. And so I would show up at 3 in the morning and I would pull out an endoscope that sadly, the really difficult part was the staff rarely got to see it, right? This was only to be done in emergent situations, or it was done in the endo unit. So that was tough, but I do believe that spending that time legitimized the whole process. They saw that it meant enough to me to come in at 3 o'clock in the morning and watch this process. And that a lot of times got some buy-in. You know, I would also say again, pull down that IFU. We have it right here. I know that you don't see this often. I don't want you to think you have to memorize it. I'm trying to provide you something to help you to follow along. So,
well, as we all know, endoscopes have very complex IFUs, and there's many different models, and you have to have competency for each model, right?
Each model, each person, each year.
So, I mean, that takes a lot of time, a lot of documentation, just as you said. I think you've heard it here with Seth. I just want to thank you, Seth, for joining me. I think for this episode, that's a wrap, and I appreciate you sharing your experience with us.
Absolutely, Kevin. Thanks for having me. Love the podcast. They're great.
Thank you, Seth. Appreciate it. Just to quickly recap, we talked with Seth Hendee about ensuring effective competency training. He shared 2 main points: documentation and time. You have to have the documents you need, i.e. the work instructions and IFUs, to develop your competency checklist form. Then, you need to take the time to do it right. It may hurt if you have to change shifts to do it, but the time you invest in the process will help ensure that it is an effective competency. Remember, competency is a skill set that is directly observed by the trainer based on the hospital's practices, policies, guidance documents, and cannot be done by the manufacturer. I want to thank you again for listening, and send us your questions to our email address, asktheeducator@hmark.com. All opinions expressed on this show are those of the presenters. Before using any medical device, it is important to review the device manufacturer's instructions for use.